To the people on a plane on 9/11s, what did your pilots tell you when they grounded all flights? My father was actually on the runway in Newark, about to take off on a business trip, when the first plane hit. They waited on the runway for a while, and then the pilot came on and said that there was a tragedy in New York, and that they were returning to the terminal, and that the flight was cancelled. Back inside the airport, they were greeted with SWAT, forcing everyone in the airport to the baggage claim. At this point, everyone knew what happened. My father has extremely poor hearing and accidentally went outside instead of down to the lower level where the baggage claim is. He said there was no one outside and that it was very eerie. He was then met by a few officers with long guns who yelled at him to get to baggage claim. Once he got his luggage in the chaos of people, he walked all the way to the private car park place a mile or two away. The buildings had already collapsed, and the whole walk he could see the smoke rising high above the skyline. I was 4 years old and in preschool, and that morning I was out of school due to illness. I called my mother into the living room when PBS lost its sound. Its antenna was on Twin Towers, and she flipped through the channels and discovered what was going on. Obviously, she freaked the fuck out, since my father was on a plane from the airport where a plane just exploded from. I vividly remember once the second plane hit, she freaked out much more, screaming like crazy, and I hid under the coffee table covering my ears. North Jersey lost a lot of commuting fathers in the attack, and my town's library has a large piece of bent metal from the wreckage near a memorial of the couple people from my small town who died.
My dad was an armed, high-ranking federal agent. He was flying from DC to Miami. I think definitely FL. He was woken up somewhere over Southern Virginia and asked to come to the cockpit. The pilots told him to guard the cockpit and that he was authorized to shoot. He spoke to someone confirming the authorization. He was given the jump seat next to the cockpit during landing, so he could see if anyone stood up. He told me later that the reason they were allowed to continue to Miami instead of putting down in the Carolinas was because he was on the plane. When he died in 2010, my mom showed me the piece of paper he had kept, with his notes from that radio transmission. I think my older brother has them now. Side note, when he landed, he was met by the 3 guys he was flying down to meet with, and they all drove back overnight, getting back just in time to help oversee the search at the Pentagon. I've never seen him as shaken as the day he brought home a piece of the desk from his office. A friend of mine was a pilot for Singapore Airlines flying Singapore to Seattle, I think he said. He was diverted into Canada, but only told the passengers the bare minimum that they were being diverted to another airport. It wasn't until they got inside the airport terminal and saw the TV that they understood why they were diverted. Even he was surprised at the scale compared to what ATC told him. He was also the pilot in command of the first commercial aircraft to enter US airspace when it was reopened, and he recalled being terrified of deviating from his planned track. He had an uneasy feeling in the back of his mind that there was likely an F-14 a few thousand feet above him, ready to vaporize them if he moved unexpectedly. I was on a United flight from Newark to Atlanta that morning. We were in the air when everything happened and were supposed to land about 9 o'clock. Just before landing, they held us in a holding pattern in the air. At about 9:30, we landed. No announcements were made on the plane. Just as we got to the gate and people started turning their phones on, I hear phones start ringing everywhere. What happened? A plane hit what? At that point, my phone started to ring as well. It was my wife wanting to make sure I wasn't on one of the planes, and she filled me in on what was known then. The pilot and cabin crew did not say anything about what happened. There was an eerie silence in the terminal. I did not see any TV screens. I went directly to the car rental company, got a car, and started driving north, back to NY, listening to the radio as much as I could the whole way back. I flew from Sweden to Turkey. Before boarding the plane, I remember that everyone in the airport stood in silence, watching the news on the different TV monitors in the airport. It was a really weird feeling that it was so silent in a usually hectic place. The flight went on as usual. The attack happened just before we checked into the airport. My wife was flying Paris, NYC. The pilot first came on the PA and said bombs were being dropped on US soil. Airspace was closed and they were diverting to Halifax because they didn't have enough fuel to return to Paris. Then they came on and said Halifax was closed and they would have to return to France. Not enough fuel. The plane landed in Brest on the west coast of France. No clue how much fuel the plane was left with. My wife was put up in a very nice hotel with the rest of the business class passengers and was stuck for 4 very surreal days in Paris. There was a doctor on board who was flying to NYC to do an organ transplant. He was able to access a fax machine in the cockpit to tell the medical team in NYC that he wouldn't make it and they should halt the organ harvest from the donor. Fascinating. I was on a plane from LA to Melbourne with a stopover via Auckland, and 9/11 happened while we were in the air. Halfway through the flight, all the flight attendants got really nervous, and the pilot told us that due to a safety issue, the seatbelt sign was kept on throughout the flight, which we all found really confusing. When we landed in NZ, there were armed guards with machine guns to greet us, which is very out of the ordinary for New Zealand. The first reports the flight attendants gave us was that it was the Empire State Building that had been attacked. That was how confused initial reports were. We were luckily allowed to fly on to Melbourne, but after that, all international flights were grounded for a few days. Nothing. Complete silence about it. I was flying from Toronto to Montreal. I noticed that the breakfast service ended abruptly, and the stewards were acting funny, standing at the bulkheads and visually scanning the passengers, etc. I listened to hear if the plane sounded funny or was behaving oddly. Nothing was out of the ordinary, so I went back to reading my paper. Disembarked into a sea of people at YUL. When one came down the escalator, I didn't know where I was going to stand. That many people. Many Americans that had no idea they would be visiting Canada that day. They were on the radio asking for people with extra rooms to lend, and Montrealers took them all into their homes. Within an hour, they were saying they had enough available rooms. Called my wife to tell her I was okay. My kids were freaking out at school because they were young, and all they knew was that Daddy was flying for work today, and then everyone was talking about planes crashing. I spent the week working near the airport and marveling at the clarity of the sky. Ended up driving home because flights still weren't cleared to take off. Saw several heavy military jets following the 401 highway at low altitude near CFB Trenton.
Was flying from Frankfurt to Washington Dulles. A few hours into the flight, they turned off the map that would allow you to track the flight's progress. We thought, no big deal, maybe it's not working. Then, right about the time we should be getting ready to descend into Washington, the pilot announced that we would be landing back at Frankfurt due to an incident that closed US airspace. No further information. They had quietly turned the plane around, with none of the passengers noticing. Throughout the previous few hours, the flight attendants had closed off movement throughout the cabin and seemed more on alert whenever anyone got up. The crew gave no further information until we landed. Once in the ground at Frankfurt, we taxied and parked way out on the tarmac, far from the terminals. The airport was full of returning planes, with little parking left. It wasn't until the ground crew came on board that we were told what had happened. The gate agent said that Twin Towers had been knocked flat, making a motion with his hands. It was so hard to believe, I thought he was exaggerating. Very few of us had cell phones that worked in Germany, so news was tough to come by. It became truly real once we were in the terminal and we saw video and news reports. I spent the rest of the night, it was late evening when we landed, trying to contact my family, who were obviously worried. Next day, at the small German village we were staying at, the entire town had a moment of silence for the victims. I was 9 when 9/11 occurred and my family were returning home from a birthday trip to Disney. My birthday is September 12, 1991. So I was turning 10 that very next day, so Orlando to Kansas City. I don't remember the specifics, but it didn't feel like we were in the air long at all. Our flight had been at 8:20, before the captain had come onto the overhead speakers to tell us that there had been some pretty serious incidents occurring in New York City and that they were told to land as soon as possible and that we'd be diverted to Houston. As soon as we landed, my dad had called my uncle, who lives in Hackensack, but worked in NYC, and my uncle had told him everything. My dad literally exclaimed into a kind of gasp sob, and that was the first and only time LVE ever come close to seeing him cry. When we got off the plane, it was all over the televisions throughout the airport. My mom and dad practically clung to us the entire time from the airport to our hotel nearby. The whole thing is something I cannot and will not ever forget. I was due to catch a flight back to NYC on 10:30 a.m. of 9/11. Never made it to the airport. Rented a car the next day to drive back so I could get to my apartment, which was in the frozen zone below 14th Street. Two friends of mine who were sisters were departing on two different international flights that morning. One departed, the other didn't. It was several hours before they could reach each other to confirm that neither of them had been on the affected flights. What was the frozen zone? You couldn't enter anywhere in Manhattan below 14th Street unless you could prove you lived there. London to Chicago. Pilot told us there had been a major incident and US airspace was closed. Asked us not to talk or speculate with other passengers about the incident, to minimize panic. We turned our phones on as we taxied on landing in Montreal. Both towers were already down and phones were going crazy. People who had managed to get a call through were sobbing and trying to explain to those whose phones wouldn't connect what they had just heard. Absolute sense of disbelief all round, and it didn't really hit until I saw it on TV in the hotel. One thing we were told at the time by the pilot, which I never really looked into, was that the pilot was out of direct radio contact with ATC in both London and the US at the time, so they were talking to the plane behind them, who was talking to the plane behind them, who was talking to ATC somewhere. So they were getting garbled second or third-hand information from multiple sources about planes crashing and hijackings and trying to inform their passengers while not being sure of the information they had received themselves. I always wondered if that was really how ground-to-air communications worked on long-haul flights. If so, it must have been a surreal and disorienting experience as a pilot to be told something so unbelievable without any immediate way to really verify it. My father worked for Delta at the time as a supervisor in the airport. He was working a flight that was about to push back when everything shut down. He had the final paperwork for the flight crew and ran down to let them know they weren't going anywhere. ATC had just announced the shutdown to all aircraft on the ground. No details were given over the radio, just that an incident had happened in NYC and all flights were grounded. He announced over the plane's PA that the flight was cancelled due to an unknown incident and everyone could retrieve their luggage in a few minutes. There were no TVs in the gate area back then, but a few of the shops and snack bars had TVs in the ticketing area. As people got near a TV, the word spread. Everyone collected their bags and left the airport. Surprisingly, there were no passengers screaming at the agents, no chaos, and from about 11 o'clock on the airport was deserted except for airline employees. My wife and I were flying from London to Los Angeles. About 3 hours into the flight, my wife asked why the flight map on her video screen showed the plane flying east instead of west. Apparently the 747 had just completed a slow turn. At that exact moment, the pilot came over the speaker and told us the plane would be going back to the UK because there had been an incident in New York and that US airspace had been closed down. All passengers were requested to remain in their seats and the airphones were turned off. We ended up landing in Cardiff, Wales. There were several 747s at the runway by the time we arrived. The minute the plane landed, dozens of cell phones were ringing. All the events of the day came all at once. Towers hit, towers collapsed, Pentagon hit and another plane crashed in PA, and worst of all, thousands had died. People were just stunned learning all these details. The airport terminal was just overwhelmed. There were thousands of people and the support staff were doing their best to assist us, but they had little information or resources. First they said that flights would be departing the next day so we could be getting overnight accommodation. My wife said there was no way that anyone would be flying anywhere in the near future and our best bet would be to catch a train back to London. Fortunately, there were several passengers that had the same thought and somehow they arranged to get a bus chartered to take us back to Heathrow. While waiting for the bus, we found a television and were able to see the images of the day. People were watching in stunned silence and many were weeping. Upon boarding the bus, my wife and I shared a set of earbuds which was plugged into a radio that had a US feed going through local UK stations. The news just kept getting worse and it was clear that the world had changed while we had been in the air. At about 1 a.m. the bus arrived at Heathrow, which was absolutely deserted. Eventually we made it back to our flat in Weybridge. We stayed up watching CNN International for the next few hours, and as the sun came up we finally got some sleep. It was a day we have spoken of often since that time, and one we will never forget. I still have the boarding passes in my desk. I was on a small corporate propeller flight to a small town. Was in the air when the first plane hit. Somewhere during the day they just called us, let us know that would not be flying us back. The town was so small they didn't have rental cars. That's when I learned the Ford dealership rents cars. I drove back to Minneapolis with the guy that worked for our vendor. He was from Boston. He was getting married in Boston that weekend. He eventually had to drive back. As weird as that day was, I think the weirdest thing was that we dropped him off at a hotel called the Thunderbird. It was the only one that had an open room. He pulled out the novel he had been reading and it was set at that hotel. What a surreal day. Edit, since a few questions came up in these comments. It was the Thunderbird just north of the Mall of America in Minnesota. Today I learned there are other Thunderbird-themed hotels in United States. Was it the same one as the novel? Not sure, he thought it was. I can't remember the book, but it was about a sports agent or something. His mind was absolutely blown when we dropped him off. The Thunderbird was kind of a politically incorrect American Indian-themed hotel. And that's the part that really stood out to him. He kept saying, "It's this Thunderbird, this is the Thunderbird. I'm staying at this Thunderbird." The small town was Marshall, Minnesota. In retrospect, can't recall if they didn't have a rental car place or if they were out of cars. All I know is someone hooked us up with the Ford van. It was September 11th, everybody was kinda working together. I can't even remember where we dropped it off. It must have been a Ford dealership somewhere in the cities. LOL, people who think this is a Ford product placement. It was just a day in the life, not. Everything is an ad, unless it's a Tide ad. Father-in-law was our air host on a flight from Sydney to LA. They initially told the pilot to turn around and go to Hawaii as mainland US airspace was closed. Pilot told them they didn't have enough fuel and air traffic control told him to put it in the sea then. Thankfully the situation was controlled pretty quickly and the plane did eventually land in LA after some circling. We don't have enough fuel. Sucks to suck. I was flying Hong Kong to London, so wasn't subject to the flight groundings, but the proletariat told us there had been an incident in New York and there would be increased security at the terminal. Arrived at Heathrow and there were dozens of police walking around with submachine guns. English police might not be regularly armed, but they do not mess around when they feel they need to be. Still not sure what's up, but definitely something serious. My parents grabbed a newspaper to try and figure out what happened and flipped through the very scanty initial reports with the big picture of the burning towers on the cover, while queuing for security. Person behind them asked if they could have a look and you could subsequently hear people gasping one by one as the paper made its way down the queue. Edit, pilot, apparently my phone is trying to join the revolution. Me and my brother were on our way to NYC this day. Our flight had barely left Paris, CDG, when we suddenly went into a descent. The captain made an announcement that they had been ordered to return to Paris but couldn't comply due to the by then already crowded airport. So we landed in Dublin. The airline told us that we were to be flown back the next day, but nobody really believed that, news to the why and how still being scarce. We were free to leave the airport though, so me, my brother and a couple of guys from our flight shared a cab into town, going for a pub crawl. When in Ireland, where I met a girl whose flight got grounded too. Long story short, our kids are 6 and 9 by now and remind us every day, nothing in this world is so bad that it doesn't have an upside to it. My father was stuck on the tarmac at CLE. He couldn't leave, because they were diverting another plane there that supposedly had a bomb on board. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Bonus story. as I was outside with my mom, and she was relaying what was happening with my dad to a neighbor. A plane banked overhead and turned around. Mom says, that's weird, must have to go back to the airport. It was Flight 93. My parents were flying from New York to LA and were in the air when it happened. The pilot said, "Due to a national emergency, all domestic flights are being grounded immediately and we are trying to get a spot at Indianapolis." My dad said he thought it was a nuclear attack and all of his kids on both coasts were gone. When they finally landed at Indianapolis, the airport had all the TVs off, even the arrival, departure ones, so he thought his suspicions were confirmed. Somebody finally got through to a loved one on a cell phone. Cell phones barely worked near major cities that morning, and let everyone know. He was relieved, morbidly enough. They got on a train to LA a couple of days later.